Hi, everyone. It's Janice, host of the Divorcing Religion podcast. Thanks for tuning into my show, whether you're joining me on audio or video. I've heard from some folks recently who have told me just how much the show has meant, and some of them have even found it not only to be life-changing, but life-saving, as they felt there was no one else who understood what they were going through, and they found the Divorcing Religion podcast, and they started feeling encouraged. Please help me keep my show on the air. Become a member by clicking the join button on the Conference on Religious Trauma YouTube channel. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Divorcing Religion podcast. My name is Janice Selby. I'm a registered professional counselor and a religious trauma recovery coach. My guest today is Sacha Mardou. Sacha is a British cartoonist and long-form graphic novelist who makes a home in St. Louis, Missouri, with her husband and teenage daughter. She began making comics after getting her BA in English literature from the University of Wales in 1998. Working in both fiction and autobiography, Sacha's comics explore interior experiences such as mental illness, emotional dynamics within families, her religious upbringing in the Jehovah's Witnesses, and healing from trauma through therapy. Sacha's first graphic novel, Sky in Stereo, tells a version of her JW experience from a teen perspective. Her new book is called Past Tense: Facing Family Secrets and Finding Myself in Therapy. Past Tense is focused on Sacha's life in her 40s when anxiety has taken over and she has reluctantly entered therapy. Past Tense is available now wherever books are sold. Welcome, Sacha.
Oh, thank you, Janice. It's so nice to be here. I'm a real fan of the show, and I think the work you're doing is so valuable. So thank you.
Well, thank you. That feels very good to hear. I was super curious when I heard from you talking about your book and that your background is one of Jehovah's Witnesses, because we know that that is a very high demand organization. And I want my listeners to know what it's like to grow up in that setting and what your journey has been afterwards. I think a lot of people can relate when you said that anxiety came on in your 40s. Yeah, that's true for so many people. So please tell us about your growing up and how did Jehovah's Witnesses become introduced to you and your family?
Sure. Well, thank you. So I'm from the north of England, from Manchester, and in the late 1980s, my family had been through a period of real turmoil. We'd had a situation of incest in my family, and my father was in prison. My stepsister was in a children's home. And my family was like not even realizing this is a process, a trauma to process. But around this time, when we'd just gotten past it, there was a knock on the door and two very lovely Jehovah's Witnesses introduced themselves to my mother. And I feel like having been through all this, my family was kind of like ripe for the picking in a way, you know?
Totally.
And I know Jehovah's Witnesses all often are into people's lives, and their message of the Bible's hope will touch a chord with people when they're at a very low point. And that was certainly the case for me. So I was almost 12. It was like would have been around 1987, I believe. And my mother started a Bible study. Around this time, my aunt, who lived nearby, my mother's sister, was also studying with the Jehovah's Witnesses. And it just quickly came over. I ended up with my own Bible study with a very wonderful couple. They were lovely people. An older couple, and every week after school I would go for my Bible study, and it really took over. My stepfather at the time was also studying with the Jehovah's Witnesses. So in person? In person. Oh, no, sorry. My real father was in prison. My stepfather in my family studied too. So I had a very complicated, like a very... like a very complicated blended family, which I talk about in my book, Past Tense. Right. It took a lot of therapy to unpack that too. But the Jehovah's Witnesses kind of like found us at this point in history, and we just went with it,
And so then that's kind of for a young teenager. I mean, usually as we're entering adolescence and we're thinking about dating and different various things to do after school with our peer group. And that wasn't the case for you because you were
No.
kind of really sucked in
Yes.
by the
Yeah.
Jehovah's Witness. Okay.
Indeed. And for the time I was studying, I got very involved with them. So the older couple that I studied with turned out to be kind of like surrogate parents in a way. They had a very cozy home. They were very loving towards me. They would drive me to meetings. I thought they were being so kind, not realizing this is how the indoctrination happens. You become very enmeshed in the community. And that's what happened. They became my peer group. They became the people who took me out knocking on doors on a Saturday. I eventually became an unbaptized publisher. That's as far as I went in the organization.
An unbaptized publisher.
Yes. My mother went ahead and got baptized in around 1988, 1989. And it was after she got baptized that I started to have doubts and really pull back. And, because the pressure was on me to get baptized too. And even though I believed it fiercely for a while, I was also living a double life at school. I wasn't telling my peers so much that I was one of Jehovah's Witnesses. Turns out they all knew. But I didn't, like years later I ran into a school friend. She's like, "Oh, I always thought you were one of those Jehovah's Witnesses." And I was like, "Not me, my mom." But in fact I was as close to Jehovah's Witnesses as you can get without actually getting baptized. And so I pulled back in the nick of time, I believe, because me not being baptized meant that my mom never had to shun me, or if I wasn't discipleshiped, I could leave without consequence. And so I'm very grateful.
What made you wonder? Like, what made you start questioning? Because you had been believing, and then suddenly it's kind of like a seed of doubt was in there.
Well, it was more to do with the things I wanted from life rather than stopping believing. So even though I became physically out at some point, I still mentally believed for a long time that no, they have the right truth. It's just I can't be part of it. I don't measure up, So it was realizing that I wanted to go to university, and I had teachers at school who were telling me how smart I was and that university should be what I was thinking of. And then at home, I had the Jehovah's Witnesses who were saying, Armageddon is coming. You don't need to go to university.
They really discourage higher education, from what I understand.
They really do. They really do. Their point is that in the new kingdom, we won't need doctors and lawyers. We'll need carpenters and plumbers, to rebuild the earth when God has cleansed it of wickedness.
Wow.
And, back in the 80s when I was involved with them, they had a teaching that the generation who saw 1914 will never pass away. And so we thought that it can't go beyond 2014. So in the next 10 years or so, it's definitely going to happen. And of course, it never did. And so thank goodness I gave myself that freedom, right?
Right. And people earnestly believe that apocalyptic and doomsday type groups, when that date is set by somebody, they really earnestly believe it. A lot of them sell all their possessions, and then it is a horrible shock when the day comes and goes and they don't have a home anymore and they don't have a job anymore and they've given away all their money or whatever. It's quite a serious thing. So what was your mom's response then, and your stepdad's response to you rejecting it? Did you tell them, "I'm really not interested"?
For a long time, I would go to meetings and just go through the motions. I was bored out of my mind. I mean, there comes a point with the Watchtower where it's actually very repetitive and very boring, and after the excitement and the fear of Armageddon has become somewhat normalized, it's like the reality is I have to sit here. It was 2 meetings a week, Sunday as well. It takes up a lot of your time. And I just reached a point where come what may, I wanted to give myself a chance to go to university. And there were a few doubts as well about their teachings. They had a teaching that, that Jesus, he came down, he said, the kingdom of God is in your midst. That's how they interpret it. Whereas other religions will say the kingdom of God is within you.
That's right.
So the very spiritual part of me, that very spiritual 14-year-old who was fired up by it, had a seed of doubt thinking, well, I think the kingdom of God is within me. And so that was my one doubt, and I couldn't disprove them. I didn't have any tools. This was pre-internet, so I couldn't go online and say, here's why it's not true. But I just had enough doubt and enough self-integrity to sort of lurch away from it. And the response, thank you for asking, I actually discussed that. I actually present a fictionalized version of it in my graphic novel Sky and Stereo, where I show basically my house with a big boom on top of it, because there was a real explosion when I announced that I wasn't going to do it anymore. And it was kind of traumatizing. My mother told me that I was gambling with my eternal life. She told me that I was pleasing Satan and that I was turning my back on God, and all these things that I didn't think were true. I didn't think I was wicked for not wanting to join this church. I thought I was liberating myself. I had to give myself that chance. And so, yeah, it was very distressing. And even though I tried to leave at that point, I think I was almost 15 when I had this discussion with my mom. And my mom also chided me for letting down my Bible teachers, the lovely old couple that I studied with. Yes. She said, they've invested all this time in you and you're wasting their time, basically.
Wow.
And so the upshot was I didn't really get to leave until I was about 17. I had to keep studying with them every week. And even though I stopped going to meetings and I stopped going knocking on doors and that kind of stuff, I stopped going to assemblies and conventions. I still had to have my Bible study just to kind of keep them off my back a little bit. And it was interesting to witness how people from the organization, from the congregation, so teenage girls my age, decided to be friends with me and be nice to me. They'd never paid any attention to me before, but when I announced I wanted to leave, they came around to really tell me why that was a bad idea and why the congregation was offering them so much. It just felt like a ton of pressure at a young age.
So much emotional manipulation going on there. That's just outrageous, really.
Yeah. And I feel that it ill-prepared me for life in the real world. So when I hit 17 and started going to clubs and dating boys, and, I really got myself into real trouble and ended up having a sort of mental breakdown when I was 17. I actually spent my 18th birthday in a psychiatric hospital, which is something else I talk about in Sky and Stereo, my first book. Wow. And I know that has a lot to do with the Jehovah's Witnesses, which is why I felt like I had to include that story.
Right. And so was it the pressure? Pardon me. So when you've managed to liberate yourself, you're not having to you're not going to the Bible studies every week, and you're really starting to dig into the life that's outside of that bubble. Pardon me. And then did that stress, that pressure just seem like too much? Like this was being expected of you at home, but then there was this whole other life that could be lived?
There was definitely an element of it. And I think another element of it, because you're so sheltered within Jehovah's Witnesses, and a certain kind of behavior is required of you. They really emphasize mildness. You'll behave in a mild manner. You won't ask questions. You won't challenge. And so I had this aspect to my personality where I just would go with the flow. And I would say yes to things that I should have said no to, and I should have been more curious and more into self-preservation. And I didn't have those aspects of my personality sort of baked in due to my time in the Jehovah's Witnesses.
Right. So, there wasn't really a sense of autonomy.
No, and no street smarts, So I made some really bad decisions. And I think also an aspect of it is that there is such a fantasist element to the Jehovah's Witnesses. And I think magical thinking was a real issue for me. I still believed in their dark vision of the world, and their dark vision, like that they glean from the Bible. And that has taken like many, many years to unpack. And I think where I found myself was that after I did get away from this, and after I got out of the psychiatric hospital at 18, I did go to university. I turned my life around, but I began to operate from a place where, okay, what's past is going to be very firmly pushed down. I'm going to put everything about the Jehovah's Witnesses in a box and never touch it again. And it's taken me until my 40s to actually begin to open that box and get curious and deconstruct,
Wow. Yeah. And feel safe enough to do it, to be able to be curious.
Right.
How did your mom, what was the response then when you were hospitalized? Because that's significant. Mm-hmm. Did your mom, did she visit? Were there any discussions there? Did she realize she had to step back, or?
She was quite wonderful in many ways and very loving. Yeah. And, she is still one of Jehovah's Witnesses and always will be. But she is also as close you can get to a real Christian in my mind. Like she operates from a real place of like love and compassion. It's just she has all these beliefs that I cannot see eye to eye with, So this is in no way to denigrate her. And during my hospital time, she was very loving. And my relationship with her we did mend a few bridges that had been broken. So some good
Oh,
things came out of that.
yeah.
I will also say that there was quite a lot of shame, and she told all the people in the congregation that, my drink had been spiked with LSD, and that's why I was in there. It wasn't anything I did myself, and of course it was. It was my own actions that had sort of in part led to my breakdown.
Well, and certainly I could see church members doing at different points, if she hadn't said LSD was, part of the equation, is that, well, of course she stepped away from Jehovah.
Exactly.
She's rejected Jehovah. So we expect her to be lying in a gutter somewhere, because that's a fear tactic used not just by the Jehovah's Witness, but by many religious, insular religious groups that really want you just to stay in that group.
Indeed.
It's such intense pressure.
It is. And, I'm aware of the ways in which I got off so lightly when it came to my involvement with Jehovah's Witnesses, and people who are born into the religion and find themselves leaving in their teen years. They find themselves without an infrastructure, without family, society, the people they know. And for them, there are so many bad cases of things that happen to people when they leave the witnesses. And I do believe it's because that family structure has gone. They're unsupported. They're often, without a job or education, and it can be very, very damaging. So yeah, right. I have so much sympathy and empathy for people in that situation.
Oh, and exactly what you even described earlier, the idea that when you did step out into the world, you were completely ill-prepared for it. There was a lack of autonomy and a lack of even seeing danger, because you just weren't prepared for it in that way. So that's so fascinating. So then there were some good things that came out of that time in the hospital, and then you were ready to start university.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's
and how did that go? What was that like? Were you living at home or were you living on campus?
No, I lived off campus. I went to the University of Wales, and I was a little bit later going to university because I'd spent my 18th birthday in a psychiatric hospital. I had to kind of go back and finish my, my A levels, which are the equivalent of the GED in America. So I had to kind of go back, and I was kind of like the oldest one at college in a way because, I'd kind of like missed 2 years by having to like go back and take my exams again. And so my 20s were a time of like high anxiety, but I was also quite driven and quite determined to, kind of like forge my own path forward. And so parts of me like were very strong, but operating from a place of internal, like I had an inner critic who through my 20s was like, you are not going to mess up. You're not going back to the Jehovah's Witnesses. You're going to do this yourself, and you're not going to ask for help. And all these ideas that I took with me into kind of like my 30s. And, when I moved to America and had a child, life was wonderful. And yet I found myself unable to enjoy any of it at the age of 40. That's when anxiety kind of like really took over. Despite having built a wonderful life for myself, it was like, well, why am I so frightened all the time? Why am I so anxious? Why am I having nightmares every night? And this was what I really began to unpack by going to therapy. And that's what I talk about in my new book. So really the healing journey from all those early experiences. I talk about like the healing and how that comes up in therapy. And, my plan was to take the reader with me. I want the reader to come with me into the therapy session and actually see the nuts and bolts of like how we, something will come up and how we address it and process it and find healing.
Oh, yeah, because it sounds like the pressure. So you got out of the high pressure situation, but then the internal critic and internal pressures took over and almost even preventing you from being able to fully be present and enjoy the pleasures of life.
Yes.
And that's so sad.
Yeah, it is. And, Bessel van der Kolk in The Body Keeps the Score, he talks about how childhood trauma, that it serves to kind of like fragment us and disconnect us, from our emotions so that we're not suffering so much, we're not feeling the intensity of our pain so that we can survive, but it also numbs us and keeps us from like real connection with other people and from ourselves. And so joy is very difficult to find when you're in a hypervigilant state of anxiety,
Right. Yeah. How much of it do you think was the knowledge that your mother was very disappointed that you were not, that you were rejecting what she believes to be the truth?
Okay, so by the time I'm in therapy, I'm 41 and I'm living in the United States. And so my mother is 4,000 miles away. So we have this physical distance between us. And when we would get together on vacations, it'd be like 2 weeks, 2 intense weeks in the same house together. And though I would feel so much internal pressure, like this is our only time together. We have to make the most of it. I don't want to fall out with her. And so I had to be very careful, continually like tiptoeing around things, like one time I kind of caught her. She had a Bible open, and I talk about this in the book. She had a Bible open and to show my husband Bible passages. And I just feel so much internal like anger. But obviously I can't display any of it, because I have to kind of keep the peace. That's how it felt. And yeah, I wasn't very successful because I would be antagonistic or I'd be icy or cold. So my anger would find its way out.
Oh,
So
yeah.
none of it was working, And so
Right.
in therapy, a big part of my therapy was how to navigate the relationship with my mum. And it turns out that it was more about me necessarily than her perceived feelings of disappointment in me. Obviously, I did feel that I was not the daughter she wanted me to be. She wanted me to be a Jehovah's Witness daughter who'd married into the truth and followed that path with her,
Mhm.
and yeah, that's not what happened. And so I felt, how can I ever make her not disappointed in me? It didn't feel possible to change that.
Wow, this is so applicable to many of the clients that I see recovering from religious trauma,
Right.
regardless of the background. So you weren't born into it, but you were relatively young when your mom came to this conclusion. And just that fear of disconnection, of disappointing our parents, of not being, it's like we can outgrow our parents' hopes and dreams for us, but that's a painful process because they're still stuck on, oh, but I really wanted this. But we have to step into our own lives and into our own self and really take up residence there and say, thanks, mom, thanks, dad. I've made it
Yeah.
this far and now I'm going to keep going my own way. And that
Yes.
can be a
Yeah.
hard thing to do.
It really can. I think the wonderful thing about therapy for me was my therapist asked fantastic questions that I'd not thought to ask myself. One of the things he pointed out to me was that my mother believing that, Armageddon's going to come and a new world is going to happen. He said that's a real fantasy, right? She's been holding this fantasy since like the 1980s. And that's not reality, It's like I can recognize the fact that a part of her is holding this like fantasy and that she had other fantasies of me being this like model daughter. And it's
Right.
like what I had was like, I don't have power over what she believes or wants, but what I do have power over is me and my own agency, and pointing out that I had the agency to do things differently and recognize the ways in which she was triggering me or pushing my buttons. And so when that happened, what needs to happen? Do I need to convince her that she's wrong and she needs to stop pushing my buttons? It's not possible. What I needed to do was really start recognizing, wow, I'm super activated, and get curious, how can I tend to myself? How can I look after the little part of me inside, which is really kind of like taking over right now? So we
Yeah.
used a form of therapy called internal family systems.
Hmm.
And that for me was, as a very visual person. And so obviously the book is full of drawings of me and my parts because it's told completely in
Yes.
comics. And it was learning to work with the activated parts of me, the triggered parts of me. And that made such a difference. And I think drawing it is also part of the healing process, because
Oh,
creativity gives you so much access to calm and kind of joy in a way. So
oh, I get chills thinking of you putting pen to paper and drawing the different parts of yourself and knowing that maybe a young person, a teenager, even an older person will come across what you have written and it might make so much sense to them and they feel like,
yes.
yes, this is what it's like. This is what's going on for me. I'm not the only person. That is so powerful that you
Thank you,
chose to do
Dennis.
that.
I will say that when I first started drawing my, therapy sessions, I started because I am an artist. I have a sketchbook with me all the time, right? And so I would get out of therapy and I would get the Metrolink back to my house. And so I'd have time sitting at the Metrolink station waiting for the train where I would just write down and draw everything that had happened in therapy. And I never thought I'm going to publish this. I never thought, I'm going to turn this into a story and share it with the world. Even then I was like, oh, absolutely not. This is private.
Because it's pretty intimate. Yeah.
It's very intimate, and it took, so this was 2017, I was in therapy, and it took 2 years of doing the work before I started to think. In 2019, I was like, this is kind of interesting. And I think I'd like to kind of put some of it online. And so I very tentatively started sharing it then. And that whole act of sharing my therapy little stories was actually very, very scary. And I remember there was one comic I posted, and after I'd posted it and shared it, and it was a kind of a personal story, I had a real shame backlash. And so I had to do a little process and work around the shame. And this shame part of me said, who asked you to write this? Nobody wants this from you. This is embarrassing. What if your family reads it and all this? And inside all this internal rebuke that I was giving myself, there was a 14-year-old part of me who I found her, and she was like, no one's ever told my story before. I want to hear it. And this 14-year-old has been with me, this former Jehovah's Witness kid, she's still with me, and she's kind of on this journey. Even since the book has been finished, there is more work I'm finding to do around my time in the Jehovah's Witnesses and more things to unpack. And she is kind of my companion in this. She is that little Christian kid who, was so like in love with the Bible and so in love with Jesus. And, this was a real part of me that I think I have in common with a lot of people. I read Elaine Pagels' Why Religion, which is a wonderful memoir. And she talks herself about, being 14 and going to see Billy Graham and just how it lit a fire inside of her. And I didn't realize before, but teenagers are so open to the world and so open to spirituality and cosmic ideas that it's actually pretty normal that I had this little inner 14-year-old Christian kid,
I was also 14 when I had my big, then going down to the altar and then and I think also at 14, we're trying to find our identity, trying to figure out who we are. Yes. Okay, this can be who I am. And then we can really be brazen about it and courageous about it. I am this, I am that. And then sometimes later on, it could be hard to say, oh, you know what? Yeah. I was that, but I'm not that anymore. Right. And that can be hard for us to let go of that. I love that you've connected with your inner 14-year-old. And I'm wondering also, what about, so you mentioned some of the issues that were going on in your family around the time that Jehovah's Witness entered. So at some point, you got curious about your mom's life, what kind of really primed her for these people coming to the door. And then you took it even further and looked at your grandmother to see how some of that trauma was intergenerational.
This all started with a conversation that I'd had with my mom. About a year before I was in therapy, she told me this, that she was a victim of a sexual assault when she was 13. Then she'd also told me that when she was 13, she kind of like broke with her grandmother's, very, very mild Church of England, upbringing. And she joined her own Christian group. And I just made this connection. It's like, oh, she had a sexual assault at 13 and she joined a church at 13, like of her own volition. And so I made this connection, this little inner detective part of me. It's like, oh, the two things go together. This is why. And when I brought this up to my therapist, he said, what you've connected may well be the case. But he pointed out, also doesn't mean that you're showing empathy for her. And he was absolutely right. Like I was rationalizing her experience and not actually feeling any empathy or sympathy for her. And it took a lot of therapy before I got to that point where, I actually began to feel like anger and grief over what she went through. But it did set me on this path of kind of exploring her life. And obviously I don't want to tell too much of her story because that's kind of her business. But the things she shared with me that I got permission from her to share in my book, it made me very curious about my grandmother and what it was like for my mother at the age of 13 when this assault happened and she joined a church. And piecing all these things together, like I found out that my grandmother would frequently abandon. She had 6 children. It was like a large blended family right after World War II in England, in Manchester. And my grandmother had an invalided husband who would actually die very young. She had a child with sudden infant death syndrome, in 1948. Yeah. And then before that, during World War II, she lived in a part of Manchester called Trafford Park, which it was, it made a lot of the material for World War II. So it had factories that made, bombs and engines and that kind of thing. And so it was a real target for the Luftwaffe. And so during World War II, like around 1940, 1941, high density bombs would be, high explosive bombs would be like dropped like on her neighborhood because she lived right by the factory. And so she had like lived through the bombings. She'd lost her first husband, was killed in Italy. And, 2 weeks before the war ended, he was killed. So tragic, And she also lost her brother. Her brother was on a merchant ship that had been torpedoed by a German U-boat. And so my grandmother had all this loss, experienced aerial bombardment. After World War II ended, her life wasn't necessarily any more fun or easy. And she, ended up my mother became a very parentified child. So she, like, in effect, raised her younger sister and looked after her dad who was sick. And so I began to see how, these ripples of trauma, like it didn't start with me, didn't start with my mum, it kind of went back. And even my grandmother, like if I look back at her childhood, she lost her own dad when she was 13. They lived through poverty and, real struggle and uncertainty. And it's like, okay, I'm just one family. And World War II impacted it in such a way, like how many more families? It gave me so much understanding of how there is so much trauma and unhealed pain in our world. And, like therapy was the real way to open this. I think Bessel van der Kolk talks about how trauma is harming the fabric of our society, through crime and addiction. And until we start, looking at the sort of communities in prison and the trauma they've been through, which is part of why they're in prison, there are the means to heal these things and to address them. But I just feel that these lessons from therapy need to become part of how we understand society, which is another part of the reason why I wanted to make this book, because all the great information I was learning in therapy, I was paying a lot of money for it. Therapy was expensive. And it was behind closed doors, like no one was actually teaching me this. I had to go to a place and like learn it from myself. And so I was like, how great would it have been if someone could have taught me these lessons about emotional health and healing when I was like in my 20s, I should have gone to therapy then, but I didn't. Because there's such a stigma,
Wow.
So I really would love this to be like part of the common knowledge,
Yes. And it feels like one thing that has really changed in the years since, since World War II, and then even since your mom was growing up, community, church used to play a really important role because it is a community. But unfortunately, churches are built around magical thinking. And so it's a club. And if you believe these things, if you say these magic words, you can be a member of the club. But it has conditions attached, that membership, right? And so the people who come to me have left those communities, but now they are starving for new community, which can leave them vulnerable because sometimes then they fall into other high demand groups or cults, just because they're so desperate for that feeling of community. I would love to see humanist communities just popping up everywhere where we just love people and care for people because they are people. And we don't have these hidden agendas for them. We just want to see people be healthy and happy and succeed. Because if we can do that in smaller groups, it has it has a ripple effect. So I would love to see that happen. And part of it is happening online with different, like I run a support group for people recovering from religious trauma. And I know there are other groups for people recovering from religious trauma as well. One thing I did think of when you were sharing your story about your mom's trauma was relatively close her age to the age you were when the witnesses came a knocking at the door. And I think my mom developed very serious cancer when I was 19, and we almost lost her. And she made it through. I still have her today, but I know when my own daughters reached 19, stuff came up for me. And so I wonder if some of that might have been present subconsciously or unconsciously for your own mom about the time you were 13, 14, and these people come over. She could have also just been having some of her own things come to the surface because of the age you were.
I really think that is the case. There's a part of the book when I'm in therapy and I'm really, trying to kind of like process and feeling the feelings around my mum's sexual assault when she was 13. And one of the connections I make is that when I was 13, she stopped parenting me. I was going off with the Jehovah's Witnesses, doing my own thing. I was cooking for myself. When she wasn't doing her Bible study, she was at work. She was like a complete workaholic out of necessity. But yeah, I definitely felt when I was 13, she basically abandoned me for a while. And that was due to her own experiences at the age of 13 and not wanting to deal with me. And in saying that, Janice, my grandmother, she lost her father at the age of 13. And so it's like a real age, which is a legacy burden for the three of us,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. And was it easier for you to connect to your grandmother's story with empathy? Because it was harder when it was your own mom. It's like she was too close.
I will tell you, when I was doing the artwork for this book, when I was drawing the sections around World War II and my grandmother and all the people she lost, those were the pages that I would just put my pencil down and my paintbrush down, and I would just cry. All this like feeling would come up, like my poor grandmother, to like live through that. And also to know that you're not special, like it was happening to her neighbors too, and I think about how all the families across the UK who were kind of like bombed, all the families across Europe, across Japan and Asia who have this in their families too. It's like, I think it's really important to sort of talk about it and acknowledge that the pain and suffering that our, ancestors went through, because I do believe it lives on in us. A lot of research has been done into epigenetics, like with Jewish populations whose, descendants of the Holocaust. But I think, like there were other traumas happening in World War II that people just got through. They didn't have time to process it. They just had to move on and survive, And I think we're carrying it on this epigenetic level that I don't fully understand. But I know, like on a protein level, I'm made of the same, DNA that my grandmother's made of.
That's right.
And I'm an inheritor of these stories, and I know that being able to spend time with these stories and to make them real, it's actually been a real source of connection between me and my mother as well. This book has not been easy for my mum. She gave me permission to tell her story.
Wow.
And yeah, I am writing about some very traumatic things that happened secret things that happened in our family that our family carried. And to have her permission was incredible. I also have permission of my half sister. My father went on to have more children after he got out of prison, and his past was kept secret from them. And so making this book has been a bridge, and I've had conversations which I never thought I'd have. I thought the past was buried and that's where it should stay. But in making it alive, I've actually made bridges and relationships, and we've been able to talk about difficult things, which I never thought we'd be able to talk about. And on my last trip home to the UK last summer, my mother and I actually went to the graves of family members that I'd never visited their grave before. So my great-grandparents and my grandmother and my grandfather, and I actually visited their grave and spent this time with my mother. And my mother said, I remember coming here as a child, and to just, internal family systems. It's like I have like a little inner family within me, but I'm also a daughter, and I'm a mother myself. I'm also a niece. I'm all these relationships to other people. And, doing therapy has enabled me to actually be in touch and be present to all those aspects of myself, which I didn't used to be able to cope with. It all felt like too much pressure. And now, having gone through the therapy process and being in a good relationship with myself, it's like, I can breathe. It feels good.
That's so precious. That is just beautiful. Even as I picture you with your mom visiting graves, and your mom saying that she hadn't done that since she was a child, and so reality. So even though your mom lives for some part in fantasy, you are helping to reconnect her with reality on different levels. And boy, hats off to you for being able to navigate and maintain the relationship with your mom, who still is very much entrenched in the Jehovah's Witness world. And you have been able to continue to show her love and receive love from her. So choosing the relationship over the religion. And I'd say the same for her, that it's wonderful that she's able to do that with you, likely because you weren't baptized. So she didn't have to disassociate herself from you.
Yeah, not getting baptized was such a gift to both of us, for sure.
Mhm,
I mean, she wouldn't
mhm.
have seen that way back then, but I know that this book, I mean, the events, the journey I've been on that I talk about in this book, it really has been a journey that we've both been on. She's been with me, which was unexpected, but it really stems from the fact that when I could deal with my own reactivity, when I could feel myself getting activated and traumatized, being able to sort of have a new way to soothe myself, to tend to myself, and be compassionate with myself. I really had to learn that, because that compassion for myself, I wasn't given it as a child, and it didn't feel like born into me.
That's right.
I wasn't born into a family where we sit around like looking after ourselves or thinking that self-care is important,
And has this then spilled over into your relationship with your own children?
I have one daughter, a teenage daughter, and
yeah.
yes, it has. She's not read the book, but she knows she can if she wants to. She gives me a wide berth, but she was also, she saw drafts of it, so she saw pictures of herself in the book. This is her story to a certain point as well. And it really has. I mean, I think about legacy burdens, and I think about the things that happened to me, my mom and my grandmother at the age of 13. And then at 17, we also had like another legacy burden. Things happened in our lives at 17 that were very powerful. And I think about my daughter, and I can't prevent tragedy happening when she's 17, but I know that she is not going to have to deal with me and my parts, because I'm doing that for her, so I'm giving her a lot of freedom to sort of be who she is. And there's a psychologist called Virginia Satir who, she's the mother of family systems therapy, like family systems. And she talks about having an open system, an open communication system in your family versus a closed one. And I know that in my Jehovah's Witness background, it was a closed system. If you have doubts, you can't voice them because you sound like an apostate. If you don't listen, if you don't want to obey authority, then you're just out of luck. If you have a problem with something, the problem is you, because the organization is perfect. Okay. And so I've moved from having this closed system within me, like, yes, I'm an ex-Jehovah's Witness associate, but I'm going to keep that very pressed down and boxed down. So now I'm in a place where I can talk about it, and it's a part of my life, it's a part of my history. It's something that I continue to take an interest in. Following the stories of other ex-Jehovah's Witnesses has been so life-giving to me. It's like a real source of healing and, deconstruction in my mind of all the things that I was carrying.
Right.
And so,
extremely validating.
Absolutely. I remember when I came to write Sky and Stereo, this was back in 2015, that book was published. And I never thought, when I first envisioned the book, I never thought I was going to tell the Jehovah's Witness aspect of the story of it. But there's an author called Tony Duchesne who wrote a novel called Confessions of a Teenage Jesus Jerk. And when I first read a review of this novel, and it's about him being an ex-Jehovah's Witness in the 1980s, I was like, oh, I need to read that. It's going to be so entertaining. And I read it, and it was incredibly triggering. And that book is the reason that I put the Jehovah's Witness story in Sky and Stereo. So, it's the influence of others has rippled out, and the fact that he was willing to talk about it and treat it as something that you can put in literature. You can put this in a novel. It needs to be out there. And that gave me a real freedom. So moving towards an open communication system has really included the stories of other people and given myself the freedom to read books that as a Jehovah's Witness I would not have been allowed to, such as Crisis of Conscience by Raymond Franz. And James Penton wrote Apocalypse Delayed, which is a history of the Jehovah's Witness organization. Ironically, these are all books that my mom doesn't have the freedom to read, but I have given myself the freedom to read them.
Oh, and yeah.
It's so helpful. It gives you a lot of understanding and a lot of human empathy in a way. My family wasn't the only broken family who found its way into this organization.
Right. Oh, right. And I feel like we must talk about it. Religion is the last sacred cow.
Yes.
People really get very upset and bothered when I dare to say religion is not benign. Religion, in fact, can be harmful and even deadly in many cases. And typically religious people don't like that, and people who have never been touched by religion, or they don't recognize that it's touched them at all. The people who are very supportive of the work that I do are people who have suffered as a result of religious trauma. So I think it's super important what you're doing as well. And I wondered how did talk of, or even still maybe today, talk of doomsday and Armageddon, do those still trigger any kind of response for you? How are you doing with things like significant climate change, and or is that something you still deal with, or did you come to a point in therapy that helped to kind of take the wind out of the sails of those triggers?
That's such a great question. And I'm no longer in therapy. I finished therapy in 2020. But I still keep internal family systems as a kind of tool I use with myself.
Yeah.
And it finds its way into a lot of the comics, especially the ones I put online. And if people want to follow me there, they will actually see I've got a few comics about this very subject. Now, one of them is quite recently, I was watching a show called The Three-Body Problem. And it has a ship on it, and the ship is called Doomsday, and they're talking to aliens. And I found myself watching it with my husband. And I'm like, we need to pause this. I'm having some kind of anxiety attack. And we talked about it. And I kind of realized that every time Judgment Day, Doomsday, Armageddon is bandied around in the media, something would happen in my body and I would get like really, really activated. And so I've actually, part of the way I've been exploring this is through like education. And so I've been reading a lot of books. I read Dr. Bart Ehrman, who's like a scholar who talks about, the New Testament. Elaine Pagels, who I've already mentioned, also kind of, she has a book on the Book of Revelation and how it was used as, war literature through the centuries. And it really diffused a lot of the fear I felt, because reading Bart Ehrman especially, I kind of understood that the Book of Revelation was written by a man who was suffering from intense persecution. And he was writing a kind of genre of literature, which is, apocalyptic literature. He was writing it for an audience of his people, his time. He wasn't writing it for imaginary people 2,000 years later, but that's how we're still using it, as kind of like war literature. And the Book of Revelation was used by the Jehovah's Witnesses as a way to kind of control and keep in line. Like, you will stay in church, you will be fearful of Armageddon, and this is what will keep you close to the flock,
Right. Seventh-day Adventists as well.
Right.
The Book
and I
of
know
Revelation.
they come from the same origin, the Millerites.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So once you can kind of be able to detach and ask questions like, okay, who is this for? Like, who is the audience for this? Who wrote this? A lot of the fear around it has gone away. That's one aspect of it. That's taking care of the cognitive part. But I still find in my body, like, I still get anxious. I will still feel trepidations, especially around climate change. One of the ways that I kind of deal with that is that when I was involved with the Jehovah's Witnesses, the whole idea is that you don't worry about it because Jehovah's going to take care of everything. So you can eat a plastic yogurt, throw it in the trash, you don't have to recycle it because God's going to take care of everything. I think on my part, it makes me think that, we are here now. It falls to us to sort of protect the planet, to sort of make a difference. And even though I'm just one person, I know that collectively, the way we change things is by changing consciousness. So that's why I'm a real therapy advocate. Like, if we can do our own healing, I think so much is possible,
Wow.
The fact that I'm having this conversation with you now, Janice, is because I was like, well, I want to talk about this. There is good stuff in therapy. There are so many kind of like tools and philosophies for change that it just felt too good to keep to myself. So.
Oh, yes. Thank you for sharing it. And as you were talking about being activated by discussion of doomsday or Armageddon or anything like that, I'm reminded of my friend and mentor, Dr. Marlene Winnell. And Dr. Winnell wrote a book called Leading the Fold.
Yes.
It's a powerful book. And I was talking with her just yesterday, and we were talking about being activated or triggered. And she mentioned the idea of labeling things that come up for us, so that so if we label the things that we were taught around, say, Armageddon, that was indoctrination. So when we feel that rising up again, we can say, oh, there goes my indoctrination again.
Right.
And then it gives us some space, some emotional space from the intensity of the feeling of what's going on. When we can label things, we can be a little bit more cognitive in how we approach it sometimes. So I just thought that was a really cool idea. And also, as you were talking about kind of intergenerational trauma that happened, it makes me think of in Canada here, our First Nations and Indigenous and Inuit and Métis people suffered terribly, terribly at the hands of the church and the government, forced into residential schooling, and recognizing that, it's decades later, it's many years later now, but it still obviously leaves a mark. People were yanked out of their families. How can that not leave a mark? So we tend to think of it in terms of Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, which was such a horrifying experience. And there are other groups as well, like the Indigenous people who can relate to the intergenerational trauma, and then even individual families, like you were mentioning, the different things that went on for your grandmother and your mother and you. So instead of just kind of powering forward and getting through it, engaging the services of a licensed therapist or coach, someone that can walk us through some of these things, and someone who's willing, if they need to say, this is beyond my scope of practice, I'm going to refer you out to someone who specializes in this. That's so important. Yes. And I think as we continue doing that, healing hopefully will be rippling out in society. But we want to normalize the idea of getting help when we need help.
Absolutely. May I ask you a question, Janice?
Sure.
I believe that religious trauma is not yet in the, is it called the DM5?
Right. It's
Am I getting that right? Yeah. Do you think we're closer to that?
I think the closest we have right now is complex PTSD, and because there's so much crossover with religious trauma syndrome. So religious trauma syndrome is just basically a name for the collection of symptoms that are commonly experienced by people who have spent time in authoritarian groups and religions. And there's a lot of crossover with what people suffer when they have symptoms of religious trauma syndrome and what people suffer when they have complex PTSD, because it happened over and over again. It wasn't like a one-time PTSD-inducing horrible event. It was at home every day having to pray or do Bible study and then going to church and then all these other things. It was ongoing. So right now, the closest we have is CPTSD. I think that it might eventually. Nothing's in the DSM until it's in the DSM, and it takes time. But I'm thrilled to hear religious trauma and religious trauma syndrome making its way more into the common conversations. People, I'm reading it. I'm reading in HuffPost or something, and I'll see an article or a Salon or some other really well-known outlet, and they will be talking about religious trauma. And of course, that's why I started the conference on religious trauma. And Shameless Sexuality, Life After Purity Culture is another conference that I do, specifically helping people come to terms with how toxic purity culture indoctrination was for a lot of people. And now they're in their 40s and 50s, and I have clients even up into their 80s, and it wasn't called purity culture, back in the day in the 70s when I was growing up, but it was the same thing. It just didn't have that name. So in Seattle next year, I'm hosting an in-person event, the Shameless Sexuality Conference. So just putting a bug in people's ears out there. But yes, it's getting better known throughout society that religion does leave a mark, and it needs to be addressed.
That's so wonderful to hear. And I'm so grateful to you and people like you are having these such important conversations and putting names to what people kind of go through. And like you said, like naming it is what needs to happen before we can actually kind of like address it. And I listened to your interview with Tia Levings and I read her book afterwards.
Yeah.
It's so wonderful. And honestly, it made me alert to what's happening in this country. I live in the United States now, and Project 2025 is a terrifying prospect. And to hear from Tia that, oh yeah, this has been going on for years, and it used to be on our TV with the Quiverful family, you know,
Right. Yeah.
the Duggars. And it's
Mhm.
like, okay, this is part of mainstream culture, and it could be part of our government if we're not careful.
Wow,
So
it's
you're
terrifying.
absolutely right. I feel like this is the last frontier of trauma that needs to be kind of explored, because it goes so deep for people, you know.
Yes. And even before I had the opportunity to interview Tia, which I really loved doing that interview, in January, I was able to interview Margaret Atwood, and she is the author of The Handmaid's
Right.
Tale. And it was fascinating speaking with her, because everything in that book, all of the terrible punishments and awful things that went on, she didn't make any of it up. She took them all from different cases around
Right.
the world, from theocratic countries that are just a total mess and a horrifying situation for anyone who isn't running the country. And she said, yeah, this is on its way. Unless we do something, unless we act in November for Americans, this is what's coming. So I appreciate you for bringing that up. It's a hard time in the United States right now. I want to know, how can people get in touch with you? How can they follow you and find you?
Yeah, the best way is I'm on social media, on Facebook, my full name at Sacha Mardou, on Instagram I'm Mardou_draws. And my book, Past Tense, is available everywhere where books are sold, and it should be in stores too.
So, and spell Mardou for people?
It's Mardou.
Perfect. Yeah. Wow. This has been so nice to chat with you and find out these things. And your book is available now.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm so grateful to you, because, the Jehovah's Witness, like growing up in that organization, it's a real part of my story, and it's a real thread of what I unpack in the memoir. And when I talk to interviewers, the Jehovah's Witness thing, like, nobody wants to talk about it because there is a discomfort in talking about religion. So the fact that I've been able to do this deep dive with you and really talk about it with you is really novel for me. So thank you. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate it too. I think it's very important. And with your permission, I'll reach out to some of my other podcast friends and encourage them that they might like to have you on their show as well to discuss this, because it's important. Thanks for joining me, Sacha.
Thank you so much, Janice. I've really enjoyed it.
And thank you for tuning in today to the Divorcing Religion podcast. You heard me talking about shameless sexuality. You can go to shamelesssexuality.org and find out more there and get your tickets for early bird pricing. And if you want someone to talk to and unpack some of your religious trauma, come see me. My website is divorcingreligion.com. Thanks, everyone. Take care. We'll see you again soon.